All right. Welcome to our community check-in and updates number 2. It's our second week doing this. It's not a requirement to join us for each week, so if you missed out last week, it's totally fine. Life is crazy. But we are excited to have you with us now. My name is Natasha Jankowski, and I am the Executive Director of the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment. And these are basically an hour where we have condensed bits of information that we want to kind of target that are synthesis things we've been hearing and seeing over the last week. And then it's open, free for all time for you guys to check in, talk about how you're doing, learn from each other. Please feel free to use the chat and all of that in your wonderful works. But we're just happy to have space to kind of come together and see each other. And so do feel free to comment and unmute and talk and all of that. This is our connection point time to have. So let me tell you a little bit about how this will go in case there's any questions. Yes, the slides will be shared. Yes, we are recording, and we will send all of that out. We do have a hashtag we're using, which is hashtag NILOA webinar. Very straightforward in confusing times. If you want to keep that conversation going on Twitter, last week we did assessment music as another hashtag for fun. Of a song that you want to hear, and we're adding to it this week of assessment book. The other thing that I will say before I go into assessment book, because we need something happy at these points in time, is that all the things, I rarely do this. My slides are normally fun and lots of pictures. These slides for these webinars are very text heavy. And that's intentional because anything that I'm going to say I wanted to have on the slides, we are at over mental capacity in what we can retain right now. And if you wanted to remember what I said, but you don't want to go back to the recording, you've got it in the slides and we'll send the slides out. So if you're like, that's a lot of text, it's for you. So with that in mind, I wanted to give another shout out. Last week we had some songs that you can listen to as you change in these trying times. My assessment music today and to reminder in our COVID-19 is MC Hammer. Can't touch this before you wash your hands, maybe. That's what we need on that. I would like to add to our Twitter hashtag conversation, hashtag assessment book. This does not have to be a book that's about assessment. This can be something that you're reading, something that you would like to read if this wasn't, adding layers to your workbook and requirements and all those kinds of things. So I wanted to kick us off with, if you know me, one of my favorite go-to books for anything related to assessment or just in general, which is The Phantom Toll Booth, which I do still stand by is the best mixed methods textbook ever. So we do this and have some moments of fun because I want to remind you that we are in a dumpster fire of 2020. This is a little happy dumpster fire, and we're trying to make things a bit better with some sort of assessment music and assessment book. But I was like the happiest dumpster fire I could find. It almost makes it adorable. So last week, just to recap, if you weren't able to join, we had 3 points that we talked about, the things that were popping up that we were seeing, that we wanted to really make sure that we were thinking about as we did this work. One is that we are not in a place of testing online education, that this is really moving to remote teaching. We did not have the time to think about what is a meaningful online experience, how do we do instructional design in this period. This is a triage situation of survival and an emergency move to remote instruction. So if we talk about this as this online education moment, we could actually do harm to the really well designed, intentional, thought out online learning experiences that are out there. So that was one point from last week. Second point from last week was that compassion, not compliance, should drive our decisions at this time. That really, instead of looking to say, okay, I need guidance on this, or am I going to get in trouble later if I make this decision, that we should really make our decisions in support of our students, that should drive what we're doing. And then guidance and regulatory responses can look to what we've done and why, and support that and basically block for institutions that are moving fast to get things done instead of the other way around. So I think if we move in our best interest of our students and not to stay in alignment with guidance that is not caught up to where we are and where we need to be, we'll be in a better place. So compassion, not compliance. was the second one. And the last one was a reminder to listen to students and be flexible, that any learning that happens this semester is learning in a global pandemic crisis. Like, it always has to have that asterisk related next to it. And that everyone, faculty, staff, and students are struggling to make this move and shift, and all have that same sort of asterisk of what's going on with the semester and term. So we did some things, but there's a lot that happened in this, and we need to think about that in relation to all the work that we do moving forward. So that catches you up. There was a lot of really awesome discussion, but those were our 3 main points. This week's topics, there are more of them that we heard from folks in terms of wanting to talk about faculty evaluations, how to do it, when to do it, what are you doing with it, student surveys, and policy choices that are related to that. A lot of conversations that people wanted to have on messaging and timing of assessment reports. Do we do it? How do we talk about it? Do we ask for it? And then assessing online as well, like how do you just assess online? What does that look like? And then of course, our opportunity for general connections with the community. This week, that's a lot more topics, and I don't want to overload brains. So what I'm going to try to do is still keep it to 3 points, and by connecting them with a common theme that I see across them. So this may work, it may not work, but we shall see. So we'll jump into this. Please feel free to converse in the sides, and then of course we'll open this up for conversation. So on the faculty evaluation side of things, the questions that we're getting are, what do we do with our end of course evaluations? Do we do them? Do we do them but we modify them? Do we do them regularly but say that it's only formative? Do we do them and we keep them as summative? Do we keep them in part of the promotion and tenure process? There's also conversations on stopping tenure clocks. But if you're not in that process and it's a part of your annual review, how does this play out? What do we do with this? And basically, what are we going to do with these evaluations that we normally run? The vast majority of instances that we see, folks are leaning towards keeping some version of them, but changing the questions and viewing them more as a planning tool to help think about how do we take our summer online, and what can we do in that move, and not only looking at students, but also faculty, thinking about how did this work, what did you need, and moving in that direction. Because most places started with this semester online, now they're going summers online. We'll see if fall ends up online. Odds are moving in that direction most likely. And so thinking about how does this all fit together to help us plan for the future is what's going on. So please share what you guys are doing with faculty evaluations, and then we can open this up. But I did want to share, as you think about this, a joint statement on faculty evaluation that came out. And I'll send these slides out as soon as we're done to everyone, and these links are all embedded. But the American Sociological Association did a statement that they released. There's this chunk, it's a longer statement, of course. Academics, we have to use lots of words to get to a point. So the middle bit is where I think you can get some nice guidance on faculty evaluations, where they recommend limiting the use of student evaluations for both tenure line and continuing faculty because of the disruption, transitioning, and all of that kind of things that it's not normal conditions, we don't know what to do with it, and also being mindful of adjusting expectations for scholarly research, because you can't get to libraries, your labs are closed in terms of where you can go and all of that sort of things. People are overwhelmed, you can't get journal reviews moving through, and things of that nature. So being mindful of the current situation that's more broad than just evaluations, and thinking about what can you actually expect, and then also what do you want to evaluate. And they conclude with saying, all right, we recommend a pause in the normal procedures for this. And if, be very clear with your faculty what you're doing, but these are unprecedented circumstances. Now, I think that's helpful, and I will add to that it's currently endorsed by 42 different associations. So if you need something to point to, if that's helpful, then I think that's a good place to take a look to do a point. But it depends on how your institution used them in the first place, how they were administered, what kinds of questions were asked on them, what type of teaching staff you are, and all of that. But I would say I'd lean on the side, from what we've all seen, of if you do it, change the questions to be helpful to think about how to move forward into the future situation there. So I'm going to pause before I take this theme and move it into something related to student surveys and say, if anybody wants to unmute and chat with each other about faculty evaluations, the floor is yours. Please come forth in convo. All right, hearing none, I'll keep going. We can come back around to any of these at any point in time. Now, what I will say when we look at what we're seeing with related to faculty evaluations is we do not see something similar happening for our students, especially in the arguments around pass-fail. That idea of we need to change our expectations, we need to put some things on pause, all of those sorts of pieces are popping up very differently in what's going on. Now, our response has been to try to figure that out, has been to say we're going to survey students, which makes sense. However, I have some thoughts from what we've been seeing on the student survey conversation that I think is helpful to share. One is, please don't over-survey your students. Everyone's trying to survey them right now. Inboxes are overloaded. The amount of emails that they're getting update from your own institution on like what you're doing for COVID-19 and what webpage they can go for resources and what's going on with housing and what's going on with this, it's immense. And odds are that an email survey that's just inboxes are on overload and it might get lost. If you decide to go forward with an email form survey, please partner with your student affairs folks. They've been thinking about student surveys. Some of them have done quick touch point ones, have used social media in different ways to get information, and ensuring that you aren't sending out asking the same things, but maybe somebody's already asked and you can use that information differently. We need to crowdsource our knowledge about students' experiences at this point in time. So make sure you talk to other people before you start sending out some more surveys across the institution. Now, within your own course or your own interaction with students, take the time to be like, where are we at? How are we doing? That's fine. But if as an institution, we're continually sending out waves of surveys to students, we're over surveying, and this is not the time to do that. Another thing to think about in this that we're starting to see people do is to move from surveying to a different way to stay connected. Our students feel very distant from us and our institutions, and thinking about phone calls to say, how are you doing? Really signals how much we care and want to stay connected with our students. Doing a Zoom focus group to get people where you can see them and be like, where are we at? How is this? And other ways to reach out to connect can give you some information, but maintain that distance. And one of the things that we're thinking about, especially as we move into summer where you're not coming back and we're online, is we need to think about how do we close that distance gap that we feel with our students and our students feel with our institutions, and thinking about alternative ways to connect that's not an electronic survey is one place that people are trying to think. The last point that I would add to this conversation is I totally get it. We're a national institute. We want to research things. That's like what we're about. But I know that this may be a research opportunity, but these are people's lives. And this is, remember, it was a happy little dumpster fire, but for some people, it's a less happy dumpster fire. So we do need to be mindful as people, as human beings, and not just as data points or somebody that has the information that I need to put into a report to respond. And so I think the more that we can think of this with grace, the more that we can be mindful of not just over surveying, but overwhelming our students and our populations, the better we will be in our abilities to engage. So just, there's a lot going on. It could be a great opportunity to grab some stuff, but is it right? And will we cause harm or create, again, that distance with our students if we get them now? The last part that I would add to the thoughts on student survey conversations that we're seeing is timing. If you have kind of a disaster, let's say you have like an earthquake, right? There's an earthquake and it happens, and then cleanup starts. And so you can sort of like, okay, we're gonna time like post the earthquake and post cleanup and at different stages, sorts of things. In a global pandemic with dates that keep shifting on things, what's the timing of when you want to get somebody's information? Some of this is, what does a post-survey reflection look like? So there've been a lot of conversations on, well, we'll have them reflect on this experience. Well, at which point and when? how often, if we want to see, like, are we doing better? Are we not? Where is this happening in there? So there's a big question on timing. I have not seen, I think, a place where I feel like we've really figured that out. But it is something I think to consider in that space. I would say to some of the comments in the chat about the over-surveying as an issue, the further removed from students you are, the less you understand that as a problem. And so I think if we are, while this might not be a role of assessment professionals per se, to think about being a blocker to our learners to allow them space to thrive or survive at this point in time, the more that we can remind people of over-surveying as a problem and being attentive to what we're doing in the space, I think the better that we'll be. Now, all of that said, and all of those caveats and things that we're seeing, I offer you some resources that are unfolding around student surveys, because, you know, we'd have to do it. So there is some shared item banks that people are doing that's in Google Doc forms that you can go and look at the different questions. There's a wonderful conversation on the student affairs side. There's an assessment of research and career services listserv that has had a discussion on surveys related to students that brings in a student affairs perspective, and the way that they've been talking about, like, their plans or how they've modified, and the way that they've been using social media to like look at students and their experiences so that they don't need to survey is a really interesting one. So I point that there. And then, of course, if you weren't aware, HEADS, the Higher Education Data Sharing Group, has put out a survey on that. And Ithaca S&R is a research group, and they're offering a survey to survey students about their experience. And they have an online form, and I think it's something like the first 20 institutions that do it, they will run the survey for you. So it's of no cost to you to participate in that. But on both of those, you can see their questions. So if you want to have some resources to take a look, there are definitely those. So cautious about the survey, a lot of deep questions to ask about it. So thinking about that in relation to our faculty part can be great. One last point that I would make, let me move part of this thing on my screen so I can see, is the importance on talking about student voice. So embedded in this link, and I'll share these slides again, but you can also find it if you want this information. Dr. Werner Orr, one of our postdocs at NILOA, shared this, and it's a wonderful resource podcast that was talking about the decision-making that's been going on within HBCU institutional leaders during the COVID-19 crisis. Dr. Rosalind Clark-Artis has a wonderful part where she's talking about the decisions made in support of students, and even when we think we're making the best choices for our students, how that plays out. There's a great example in there where she's talking about that they got plane tickets for students to get them home, thinking this will get you home faster and be great. But for some students, it was their first time being on a plane, and it was very traumatic, upsetting, instead of like they would have much preferred to take the train, and so sorts of things. So while I think we do move quickly, and we need to move quickly and make these decisions, the more that we can also involve our student voice. So these are tensions, right? We need to not over-survey, but think about ways to connect with our students and understand how to help them in meaningful ways is there. So connecting with our students is important, and I think that's the key takeaway, but it might not be through a survey, and we need to think about different ways in which we can maintain that connection with our students and getting their voices in. So, and yes, if you need any other additional instances to think about why this is not a research opportunity, Jen just added some points to the chat, so check it out. So that is thinking about student surveys. Now, there's a theme that goes from the faculty to the student surveys that I want to kind of pull out here, which is something that I'm seeing in the conversations that are unfolding that raises a few alarms for me as a person. And that is some of the tensions that are being played out in policy choices that we're making in response to our current situations. As we look at what we want to do to support our students in their teaching and learning, I would please caution to avoid starting from a place of negativity in what we think about our students, or writing a policy that is designed to block a student from doing something. Whether that may be gaming a system, or, you know, a student may be able to figure out how to navigate in this crazy time to do these things, and so let's create a situation of policy in which no students can do that. If we're starting from that deficit mindset, we're we're going to end up tripping ourselves up later down the road. So let me give you a couple examples of what I'm seeing unfold that are raising those flags for me. So for one, I think while there is interest in hearing from students about their experience, policy conversations have really focused on stopping students from gaming the system, how are we going to address with online cheating, and basically running from that deficit mindset for students. So in pass-fail, one of the underlying assumptions that plays out there is that without the opportunity, without a grade to drive students' behavior, students will inherently not do the work. Like, that the only reason that they do it is because we are grading them and the grade drives them. That left to their own devices, they don't want to work hard, they don't want to learn these things, so we have to somehow incentivize it in this manner. Now, think back to the grace afforded faculty in the evaluation conversation from the American Sociological Association, and think about that in relation to this. You could make a mirror argument to say, well, if we don't evaluate our faculty under the course without looking at what students say about it, they might not try to make their course meaningful and online remote teaching and da-da-da-da. So let's create a policy to force them to do that, versus let's trust that they're trying, we're all trying our best, but this is a crazy situation and we need to adapt and modify. So this is not an okay perception of our students as learners. If we think that left on their own, they're gonna disengage, not care, and not work. That also, I think, leaves out the layers of things that are going on for our students. Where they left this semester too, we're sad, they're sad, this isn't what they expected. None of them signed up for this term. They're trying to figure out how to do this. They might not be the only person in their house trying to get online at the same time or on one laptop trying to do the work. We're all trying. And starting from a place of, we need to create mechanisms by which our students don't cheat because they're cheaters, starts to push that distance between ourselves and our learners farther away in a time where we need to bring them closer. We need them to feel as though we care, we see them, and we're here to support. So I just want to call that out, as you're doing these conversations and you're having these on your campus, watch for that kind of language or those types of things and just ask questions about it. Where does that come from? Why do we think that? And now, I know this is my slide to be like, get off my soapbox. I'm gonna breathe in, and I'm gonna move on. So I think we need to watch out for those underlying assumptions that are at play. But we can take some of those underlying assumptions that are at play and think about that in relation to assessment reports. So the other huge part of conversations that we're hearing is, oh my gosh, what do we do with assessment reports? Do we ask for them? Do we not? Do we push back the deadline? Do we change the forms that we're asking for? Same kind of questions as faculty evaluation is what we're hearing on the reporting and messaging. Now, you can think about it for faculty evaluations. That was the struggle of, how do we take a summative measure of teaching and turn it into something meaningful to make us move, which is the same kind of conversation in the reporting, which is, how do we take this summative report of assessment stuff that you did and turn it into something meaningful to help people move. So these are very parallel conversations. I would caution in this conversation that there is a distinction between assessment and assessment reporting. And we need to get better at teasing out which one that is. So first starter rule of thinking about this is, faculty, when this was like, we're going remote, we're not mentally in a place to consider assessment. They're still not quite there. They're starting to get to it. Those that thought assessment is part of instructional design and were rethinking how to do assignments and things like that, we're already there. But if assessment had been perceived as submitting a year-end report, as opposed to thinking about instructional design and how do I align with my learning outcomes, then assessment is not on their radar. There are other things that are more pressing at this moment in this move to remote teaching than assessment. So if you're at a place where faculty do not see assessment as related to instructional design and helping make that move to remote teaching so students get the learning that's most important out of it, you're probably in a place where they're thinking about this as a report. What we're seeing in how people are falling on this sort of issue and what they want to do is that assessment reports are a low priority. While we want assessment to unfold, while we want people to look at student learning, that assessment as a process is a high priority. It is ongoing. The report, not as important. So it's a high priority to help think about instructional design and how do we make choices about how to help our students learn and how to capture that learning in meaningful ways. The reporting of some kind of fill out the form and submit it in our annual reporting cycle are lower on the priority cycle, on the priority space. And I'll do in the next slide, I'll tell you what people have been doing related to it. So there's an important distinction to make in these conversations between assessment as a process of examining student learning and assessment as a process of submitting reports. And as you have that conversation, just like the please be careful, and this isn't a test of online learning, this was a move to remote teaching in the time of a global pandemic crisis. Are we talking about assessment as that process of looking at our student learning, or are we talking about what do we do with our reporting cycle? And if it's our reporting cycle, that's a different kind of conversation. So what do we see people doing? Well, the first thing that we see people doing is pushing back reports to June or later on the assessment report side, if they still require it. Some are being like, this year's a wash. We're probably not going to get anything. The data's going to be bad. People are just going to say words. So no reports. Others are going, no, we're pushing our reports back to June. Others are saying, okay, we want you to continue assessing, but we're just gonna, put a pause on that reporting process and figure it out. Others are changing the report to be a reflection. So just like people were earlier, we're thinking about how do we change faculty evaluation processes to be reflective. People are thinking, how do we change the questions on our assessment reports to be more of a reflection of what do I need to move forward? How do I feel like I got to the meaning, like the main takeaways that students needed in this course? But it is not a check-in on like, did you collect your data and did you go through the process? But really reflecting on this semester and giving people time to think that through. So that's sort of the third one we see. The last one that we see that I think is becoming a bit more prevalent, but I would love to see more of this kind of things happening, is considering reporting in an entirely different way. So normally we think of reports as a form that you submit that has a template and all that kind of thing, and everyone does the same thing. People are now starting to go, you know what, I'm just going to send a short survey and ask 4 or 5 questions about perceptions of learning and move on. And we'll just go in that direction. Others are going, I'm going to get faculty together in focus groups at a department meeting via Zoom to talk about decisions that they made and how they're thinking about students and their learning. And that recorded conversation becomes part of that documented evidence. So it's thinking differently about what counts as evidence for documentation. And we've sort of default lived in a place that reports, annual reports, are that documentation that we need, and thinking differently about what would documentation look like. There's another one that I've seen too that I think is really interesting, was that an assessment person sat in on a remote faculty meeting and took notes from the conversation and then kicked back, I heard you talking about assessment here, here, and here. Is this accurate? Or, you were talking about these things in this meeting that I heard. Is this an accurate reflection? And then use those meeting notes that they pulled together that were those things that were assessment that the faculty were like, I wouldn't have thought that was assessment, as documentation for their reports. So taking that away is something that the faculty needed to do, but also elevating up work that they were doing that were assessment. So lots of different ways. The point here is that it's a cool opportunity to think differently about reporting and what we can do with reporting in this space. So the last caveat on this one is that what you decide will reinforce for faculty what assessment is and isn't about. So if you say, nope, I want my reports and it's all these things, like here's how we do it, then it could be great. I knew it was compliance. It's not really about these other things. So framing and messaging can be very key. So I'd love to hear from folks about how you're thinking about messaging in relation to that and all that spaces. And there's really cool conversations going in the chat about this too, if you guys want. So actually I'm gonna pause there and we can come back to this to say, do other people, let's just have a chat about how we're thinking about assessing reports, collection process, what your concerns are about, what you've tried that's working, messaging that you think is good, or places that you need some examples. So I'm going to stop talking. I'll go back to this one and let you guys chat.
Natasha, this is Julie Stein at Cal State East Bay, and I'm really glad to have this conversation that you mentioned that. One of the things we're doing, because we did assessment, ILO and university assessment of written communication and information literacy last year. And there's been all these pieces of it, but there's a culminating presentation at Academic Senate to the president and provost and the whole university. And we were going to record it on Zoom and said, here's our evidence. I mean, it just makes sense. But it was also got us thinking that some of these things that you're talking about right now, like a survey or a video or something like that, would also possibly be a natural evolution of our own evidence. So I like it for now, and I also like it as sort of future thinking to be more creative. You don't change the standards, we just might update the medium or the combination of mediums. Thank you.
Yeah, just to echo that point, I think another way to think about it in terms of the standards don't change, the way we demonstrate that we've done it is what's different, is when we say to our faculty, if you use a value rubric, the criteria we're evaluating you on is the same, but many different types of assignments can get you there. And the demonstrations of learning look very different. And we know that between disciplines and the way that they go about assessing looks very different. But I think we have tended to produce for our institutions the same types of evidence of our demonstrations of these. And this is a nice opportunity to think about different ways to do that, that reinforce the types of things that we say assessment is about.
This is Joanne Penny, Oregon State, and I found a really helpful article on EDUCAUSE about the difference between emergency remote teaching and online learning. Really helpful. I don't know how many of you have seen this. I think it talks about very eloquently the difference between online instruction and emergency remote teaching, and having worked with a number of professionals who are in the online education realm and seeing how many months it takes to effectively ramp up programs. It brought that back to my attention. And it does have a section in terms of evaluating this emergency remote teaching, which I think is helpful also. But I go back to really appreciating many of the comments that are here, and the comment you made last week that I've repeated a number of times with my colleagues on campus, and that's that whole compassion piece. Our cycle is that we are doing program evaluations from last academic year. So now we're trying to grapple with what do we look at this term. But again, hearkening back to what you talked about, Natasha, last week, is we already have, in our case, 2 terms of what we did this academic year. And this will always be an asterisk in the report.
Yeah, I think that article went out on the assess listserv last week.
And Jordan just added it to the chat, a link to it too. So thank you for that.
Yeah, it was on the assess list.
This is Terry Walker from Central Washington University. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay.
Hi Terry.
We've been doing something the last few years, and we've altered it slightly this past year, and we were mid-cycle through this process, and the idea is that we're interviewing all department chairs, and we're using a standard template for the interview, but it's very conversation style, and then we write a report from that. So we're actually writing the reports from the interviews to help ease that for our departments as just one component, of course, of assessment. And this year we've added something that we call the 5 C's, our highlights from each one of these reports. And those are what change would they like to highlight? What would they like to champion in their department? What are their challenges, or a challenge that's significant, a concern, and then a call, something that they want action on. And we're, again, just right in the midst of this process, but I think it lends itself to this situation very nicely, because there are things to champion and there are concerns that we have. There definitely, we all have some of the same changes going on. So that something like that might be helpful for people.
That is a fantastic idea, Terry. Thank you for sharing. Other thoughts or ideas? Oh, Terry, would you do the 5 C's again? There's a request to hear them one more time.
Okay, is this part of assessment? Is this a, let's see. It's change, champion, challenge, concern, and call.
Woohoo! Thanks.
And that's been the focus of Bernadette Youngblood's work, our associate provost, and she's been fabulous to work with. And reframing assessment seems to be making really good progress on our campus. So hopefully that will continue in this situation.
Yes, very much so. Thanks.
Thanks.
Other thoughts or ideas? All right. Well, taking that conversation and thinking about it, I want to move us into thinking about what does assessment online look like in that space. So one of the things that we're seeing in the assessing online learning and what is learning looking like in this is 2 caveats. One, try to stop yourself from acquiring a higher level of proof in an online situation than you would in a face-to-face. One of the things that I think we're consistently hearing that goes back to that sort of assumptions we have about our students is that as soon as they're not sitting in front of me, how do I know they wrote this and turned it in? While I could sit in front of you and turn in a paper to you that somebody else wrote, and you would know it's just I'm the one that gave it to you versus I'm the one that emailed it to you. So there is sort of a knee-jerk reaction that we're seeing to go into expensive proctoring situations and all of these mechanisms by which we need additional levels of proof to show that the learning happened. And I would say that tension of additional proof, A, is not something that you need in an online learning situation, but it's also not something that you need in a learning in a global pandemic crisis situation. So I would be careful of getting into any sort of hierarchies of proof points there. The next one that I would add that we're seeing in this conversation is that the examples of online assessments and assignments that are out there and all this great literature about it might not actually be meaningful for a semester of learning, again, in a global pandemic. It could definitely be helpful for the fall and summer and situations like that where you have time to plan and you're thinking about it and building it. But I want to give you 2 examples that that I think are really helpful to get how something that would be a great online assignment for someone who signed up for an online learning experience would work that is very difficult for a student to do now. So there was a campus that went to a timed open book quiz. So if you think about like final exams are coming, how are we going to handle final exams? However, the idea that we have just gone remote, for some of our students that is true and their schedules are open and they have time. For others, you are now homeschooling your kids. you are now maybe you lost your job and you run around doing delivery at random times, and saying you have 3 hours where you can be undisturbed because that was your class time or something, let's say, is no longer a realistic expectation for our learners and our students, because they might not be able to break that time. Now, if you signed up for something where you said, okay, this is my class schedule and I can go to that, all of those things have been disrupted for our students. So it is not just where I learn, but when and how and all of the things that are going on with it. It could also be that you only have one laptop that 4 people have to use for learning, and how am I going to get it at that time to do this timed a test and things. So some of our default settings of, well, we can just switch it to this, which is a sort of standard in some online places, will not be meaningful or manageable for some of our students at this time. And if we are doing things that are inequitable for our students, that we cannot get a meaningful demonstration of their learning, then we need to back it up. So that's sort of one, thinking about that. Oh, normally a timed open book exam that's done in an online format might not be an issue. In this current circumstances and situations, it can be. Second example I want to give of that is about an oral presentation that became a video submission. So in a communications class, they were like, all right, we were going to be doing oral presentations in the class. So instead, we're going to have our students record themselves and submit videos of their recording. The issue is that if you don't have a camera, if you don't have the bandwidth to upload, if you don't have a good signal to make sure that your recording is decent, if there's any sort of feeling that the recording is quality is going to hinder my ability to think about how I can score you and actually evaluate you on oral communication. So it ended up, in this instance, a faculty member stopped that process of going, okay, shoot, this actually hinders you showing me your oral communication skills, and instead went to phone calls and said, this is the week when you have to do it. Tell me a time that works for you for your 15 minutes. I'm going to call you on the phone and you'll do your presentation. I'll give you your feedback right then, and you can go on about your day. So some of those things that we think are great examples of that quick move to online in our current situations with the layers of things that are happening for our students may not be good examples for learning assessment now. They can be for fall, they can be for later. These are things that we should work for. And these are things that we can employ as we keep moving down this direction for our distance learning. But for this semester, be very careful. For this term, think about equity, think about students, think about all those situations that are going on now. Which brings us back to thinking about how we can get student voice in there, where we're starting to see people go, okay, let's rethink how we partner with our students. Our online students, if we're doing this online, we can think about co-producing content. We can build wikis. That's low bandwidth to go in and group edit a document. Picking topics in those things, peer reviewing each other and giving feedback at a time that makes sense. So thinking differently about what we can do in this term will be helpful. So really it's just don't ask for a higher level of proof. Some of those best practices don't work now, but they will work later. So be careful what you apply now, and think low bandwidth ways to engage students on a time schedule that can work for them for really getting to the learning that's going on this semester. So those are some takeaways of things that we're thinking about from the Assessing Learning Online. So I don't have a lot of more examples for you because we're figuring it out as we go. So that's the main topics that I had to talk about. So I'm going to open this up to everybody. Last little caveat, if you want to keep the conversation going on Twitter, you can with NILOA Webinar. You can share your music choices with a hashtag of assessment music. If you want to share a book, assessment book. And if you want to be part of the rest of our webinar series, it's going to be kind of the same for each of these. While we're talking about assignments next week, the focus is to think about how can we take assignment conversations to help faculty prepare for summer and fall. And do that in a remote manner. So how can we think about ways to have assessment conversations through assignment conversations remotely? Also then this next week, we'll think about how can we think about curriculum mapping as a way to help us streamline and figure out how do we get students moving in this new normal for our situation. The following week, we'll talk about how do we document and talk about why we did what we did during this time period so that we can have that documentation to respond and push back and all of that. And then the last part will be transparency and different ways of thinking about that. So let me get out of slide sharing and turn this over to you guys for anything you want to talk about. Can be stuff we covered, can be, you know, if somebody's got a really cute dog they want to share, whatever you want, this is your time.
Hi, this is Julie from East Bay again. I just wanted to add one more example because we're assessing oral communication next year as an ILO. But when we're doing our assessment, it's not just at the ILO level. It's where are we doing it throughout the curriculum from their first year to their fourth year. And we were already planning on doing something like this, but it may be a little bit trickier for us next year. But we may look at previous data like from this year where we did what's called grad slams, where students come in and they do oral presentations which have their rubrics used to assess them. And if we talk with IRB and they don't have any problem with it, using that data, because it's naturally happening at the university. They also have research competitions in April, like last April. So it might be a year older, but even though it's a little dated, it's not perfectly in the time frame that you assessed it, it's still an indicator. And that's how we're trying to do our report, to saying, we've done the academic assessment, but let's look at all over the university and let's look at also throughout the curriculum where there may be indicators, even though they may be more qualitative than quantitative. They're still relevant and they still do what's important, which is spark the conversation about improving curriculum. Thank you.
Now, that's a great point, Julie. I think it's also a helpful point for us to remember that if it's students that are graduating, we're in a different thing and we can talk about that. But if it's students that are with us, it's not like you can only show me and demonstrate this learning at this point in time. There are other points and times in which you can show it, because ideally when you've learned it, you can transfer it and move it in different situations. But I want to come back to, there's a conversation that's going in the chat that if we're still remote in the fall, can we do some of these best practices? Can we implement it in relation to the fact that if we are remote in the fall as higher ed, meaning we cannot come back to work, students are still in the same learning situation of, if I still have one laptop, I still have one laptop. If I have unreliable Wi-Fi, if I have homeschooling, because if we're not coming back, it's probably in relation to things are still in that situation. So I think we need to figure out how to balance and be respectful of our students in a way we have not had to deal with and address before. And I don't think that's a bad thing for us to have to figure out. But it does speak to, I think, some of understanding what our new normal looks like at what point in time, kind of like the timing with our student surveys. But enough about that. Other thoughts, please share.
This is Sherry. I'm with Weave. I actually came out of K-12 education, 15 years in St. Louis Public Schools, and then worked in higher ed for 8 years. And this morning on the listserv, there was a thread about doing some different online assessments, and somebody mentioned doing like a 3-2-1 feedback in a Zoom chat, which was a really cool idea. Made me think of the fact that so that's actually a technique that I would teach my pre-service teachers when I was teaching in a teacher prep program. So all that to say, your teacher education faculty are a really rich source of really creative, innovative ways to do assessment. K-12 has been doing this a long time, and they do all kinds of things. They don't survey their students very much. That's just not part of the K-12 world. So they have such a huge variety of ways to do assessment. Use them as a resource during this time to ask them, what are some other creative ways you do assessments in your classrooms? That's all.
No, that's great. Thank you, Sherry. That is a wonderful point. And I think colleges of ed can be a wonderful resource during this too.
Hi, this is Karen Singer-Freeman from UNC Charlotte, and I've been doing a little bit playing around in my mind of trying to think about whether we could invite students to assess themselves. And, I really resonated with what you said about how this moment shows our students what we think of learning and shows our faculty what we think of assessment. And so I'm just like playing around with ideas in my head about how you might ask students, if faculty shared what their learning outcomes for the course are in this moment, right? Not the original course, but the course that they're teaching now, what they think students should get out of it minimally and maximally, and then opening it up to students to say, to what extent and how do you think you got these things? And I just would be interested, like I said, I'm playing around with it in my head. I'm getting ready to talk to faculty about it, but I don't know if anybody else has been thinking along those lines.
No, Karen, that's a great point. And I think one in which we have an opportunity to learn a lot from how people have done prior learning assessment. Because for that's a lot of students showing how they think they've demonstrated and met a learning outcome. And so there are mechanisms by which, and people that think about that often, we haven't thought about it in that classroom context, but I wonder if this is a place that we can connect across and really think differently about it. Yeah. Other thoughts? Mitchell, what's your dog's name?
Iggy. Iggy.
Oh,
Iggy.
thank you. Asking the important questions. Other thoughts? How are you guys feeling generally? Just general check-in. How are people doing? Where are we at? How are we? How's our stress level on like a? Yeah.
Hey everybody, I have a question. Since you're all being so quiet, I'll take this opportunity. So I'm Jennifer Mandel, and I'm at home, but on behalf of the University of New England. And next week, the assessment committee is meeting, and we're going to talk about what to do about those annual assessment reports. So I'm glad Natasha spent some time talking about it. And I've seen, so we have a schedule where it's programs report on June 15th, then their colleges report on August 15th, and then the assessment committee synthesizes, analyzes all of that data, all those data, and then we report in November. So one relies on the other. So if we extend the deadline, like some of you are doing, to July or August, I'm just curious for those that are extending the deadline, what happens to next year? That extension can interrupt the cycle for next academic year. And I'm just curious, maybe I'm jumping ahead. Yeah, I'm curious if any of you have talked about that in your colleges.
Well, I'll jump in with what I've heard. Was somebody gonna say something? I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay, Natasha. This is Jocelyn Chong. I'm from Cal Poly Pomona, and I started in this position about back in October, actually, just before our VOSC accreditation. And when I stepped into the position, there was already a process in place where faculty were not submitting the annual assessment reports until the end of summer, early fall. And that shift was done before I got there, just because we found that faculty just didn't have the headroom to submit by June 1st, as in the case of my previous institution. And that has worked reasonably well, even though we still chase, faculty down a little bit. And, it does, obviously, it does seem a little bit, by the time we get feedback to them, it does seem a little, I won't say redundant, but at the same time, it's a little belated, I guess. But regardless, I think faculty do appreciate the feedback. We just kind of have to pivot to just a different timeline. I don't know if that helps put you at ease a little bit more, that there are institutions who already have a different timeline than what is really typical. It's just what makes more sense and more manageable for the faculty.
We do the same thing at DePaul. It took a lot of time and heartache, and just eventually it's what we came to, is that a lot of faculty wanted to do their assessment. We are on quarters, so we don't even end our spring quarter until mid to the end of June. So, and so as soon as that quarter is done, our faculty are out until, you know, and then we don't start again until September. So they're gone until September. So we don't even collect assessment reports until October. So, I mean, it's not going to work for everyone, but that just, it works for us.
So,
Can you hear me? Oh, thank you. Hi, thanks, Natasha, for this informative session, and to everyone. If I may share just, a few points in terms of what we do at the University of Oklahoma is it's probably similar, to the person that just spoke, a minute ago. But what we do is, instead of requiring faculty to submit program assessment reports at the end of the academic year, we usually ask them to submit assessment reports the following semester. So for instance, assessment reports for this academic year would be required, or would be requested in the middle of next fall. That way then faculty have some time at the beginning of fall to reflect and think about how to close the loop and all of that. So it gives them time to do that. And also because most of our faculty members, being a research institution, they're not really contracted during summertime, so they're not actually here during summertime, in the normal, normal time. But one thing that we are also trying to do this semester is, this year, in terms of what's happening, the extraordinary time, is to allow faculty to really document what they are able to gather in terms of student learning, especially with regard to to fall 2019. However, for spring 2020, which most programs actually rely on in terms of getting everyone together and discussing assessment reports, we are providing them with an opportunity to say, well, because we were unable to gather assessment reports and talk about it in the usual way this semester, here are some reflections that we can share in terms of what is going on relative to how the situation has impacted our teaching and has impacted student learning. So we are giving some lots of flexibility, so that faculty can report what they are able to report, as opposed to sticking to our template, so to speak.
Thank you, Felix, and thank you all for sharing. I want to be mindful of the time, and I know how other people have things to go. My last point I would do as a shout out for Jennifer on your question is that you can also think about this as a cut point, a BC and a AC maybe cut point to restart a clock or make a new cycle schedule for reporting, especially if you think this will go into the summer, things continue in the fall, and we're still trying to find our footing. If there needs to be a different way that we're thinking about the timing of the reporting schedule, and we're seeing some of those conversations, and I'm happy to share that with you. But thank you all for coming. Thank you for sharing your wonderful thoughts and everything. We hope to see you next week. And enjoy your day. Take care and share some books or animal pictures or pictures of dumpster fires, whatever makes you happy at this point in time. But thank you so much for everything you do, and best of luck with the rest of your week. Take care.